I look at maximal strength stuff as increases cross-sectional area, increase the total pressure and fluid of the system, and then everything else is getting the pendulum to move up and down in a way that geeks us and gets us moving down the track faster. If they don't feel like they have some pop, then you're heading down the wrong direction with the athlete, in my opinion.
That was Mike Bruno, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Great to have you here. This week's guest is Mike Bruno. Mike is an athletic performance coach at Clemson University. He has education in both sports performance as well as massage therapy, and his approach is heavily influenced by Bill Hartman's model of biomechanics and human movement. On today's episode, Mike discusses speed and power training through the lens of one's structural archetype and how we manage pressure in our bodies. Through the show, we'll be talking about speed and power training methods, a lot of work in the weight room based on one's structure and how we can steer one's training program towards that structure to get them their best results. This was an awesome conversation with Mike. He is a brilliant coach, and I know you'll enjoy this one. I certainly did. Let's get on to 456 here with Mike Bruno. Mike, it's great to have you for this show. I'm super excited. I know that the biomechanics, speed, and everything that goes with it. I'm super excited to get into it today. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I know anyone who Rick Franzblau recommends with flying colors, I'm like, okay. I get a lot of requests for this show. A lot of AI requests, like just some random, hey, tennis, baseball gloves, and have this person talk about. So a lot of things that I'm like, no. But as soon as Rick sent me an email, I'm like, all right, let's do it. And so I'm really excited for this. Tell me a little bit about your background. So I know you have both a therapy and sports performance, and then getting into Bill's model. I think it'll be helpful just to shape kind of that thought process of how you see the world of training and performance.
Yeah, sure. So I started off in the private sector, and I kind of as soon as I graduated undergrad, I moved out to Columbus, Ohio, and I started training out there. I had some experiences with RPR and that whole crew with Cal and JL, and then Chris Corfus, obviously, as well. And then I moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, and I learned under Dr. Young, and that was great. And then I was like, I need to be in the more of like the high school setting. So I moved back home and I went to massage therapy school because I was like, I want to be in the private sector. I need to have something different. I need to be able to put hands on athletes, which I think now is immensely important. I don't do it at Clemson, but I think it's so important for understanding how athletes move and what they need and all that. I think it's really important. I'm glad I did it. And then from there, I was working with a high school team, and I kind of high school football, which I loved. And I was like, I need to be in a team sport setting. So I moved to ETSU to get grad school because I know I needed a master's. And then from there, I went to Clemson because I had read all of Rick's stuff, listened to his podcast with you, and I was like, this is where I need to be. So I interned there. And then kind of the long and short of it is that I ended up back here. And now I'm the assistant director at Clemson, and I have men's soccer and track and field. So,
yeah, tell me a little bit about your background with getting into some of Bill's work. So Bill Hartman, you had him on obviously several times. Rick Franzblau, been mentored by Bill. Tell me, and that is so cool too with the massage and the hands-on piece. And I'm not a therapist or licensed, but I've seen over and over the value of people who have those skill set combinations.
Yeah.
And it's just, and as well too, like even just learning, like any massage therapist who works on you, their knowledge of anatomy is so heightened because they're using their hands. So you learn the body in a way that's more than just school. Hey, here's a muscle. This is what it does. You're actually interacting with that. And so I think that's really obviously that educational piece is so important and helpful when you can have it. But tell me how you got into Bill's work and his model.
Um, so I actually first got introduced to Bill through John Herding, who John Herding, I interned with him in Garnet Valley in like outskirts of Philadelphia. And that's when I kind of started about this Bill
Hmm.
Hartman character.
Hmm.
And then it went away. And I was, I did, all of my stuff. And 4 or 5 years later, I got into like PRI through Rick. And then Rick got into Bill. And then I was like, "Oh, I know who this Bill guy
Yeah.
is." And then since he kinda introduced it to our staff, I've been to the intensive, me and Rick have both been, and so it's such an intuitive, model of, like, very comprehensive to look at human movement and subsequently performance. So that's kind of how I looked at it. And then the massage piece, I will tell you, and I've never met him, but I heard he's great. Kevin Neild
Mm.
used to work in the private sector in Pittman, Jersey, in Endeavor, and he was one of the reasons I went to get a massage therapy license because I looked at his staff and they all had massage therapy license. And I was like, oh, I have to have this if I'm going to work in the private sector. And looking back, great decision. And it's really helped with my anatomy and stuff like that. But yeah, to make that come full circle there.
Yeah, for sure. And I do find, even if you aren't working on someone with your hands, just understanding like Bill's model, understanding and having a close eye for what is supposed to be moving. Like if you're doing like a range of motion test and you can see
Hmm.
and notice how the body compensates and you have that eye for understanding, I think that also is just it's so valuable because it changes your perspective on the core of how they're producing movement, how far they can take that strategy with lifting. And for the sake of this show as well, I know we're going to be getting into a lot of, well, how does understanding biomechanics and the deep function of the body matter for, well, how high do we take squat maxes before they don't matter
Yeah.
or before there's a negative transfer for certain people and situations and things like that. And so excited to get into that. And then, you had said it. I love the term inside out approach to speed and really human movement in general. I think speed is
Yeah.
just the most big, flashy. Yes, no matter what you do, your speed is something that's pretty universal. And the first time I'd heard the term was Katie St. Clair. I know she had been to Bill's Intensive way back in the day, just talking about an
Yeah.
inside out approach to the body and how we move and understand the hardware first. So tell me a little bit. So I know obviously Bill's model, lots to it. You could probably study it for 10 years and then still feel like you have 50 more years of work to do. But when you are looking at an inside out approach to speed, what are some of the primary components that you are looking at? Where do you start when it comes to an athlete's basic skeletal alignment, biomechanics, physiology, that you'll then say, okay, now let's look at tracking exercises or what exercise is better for you versus another athlete?
Yeah. I think it starts with kind of understanding the three pieces of the abdominal like cavity and kind of like working out from there, right? So if you look at the abdominal cavity and you understand that that's where all the organs are housed, but if you understand how they're being housed, like they're encased and they're also being suspended by mesentery. And so the normal person would be like, they look at that and they're like, oh, that's just organs. They have no influence on anything. But really, that's just potential energy, right? So 15% of our body weight is built in organs. And so maybe 6 to 8% is housed in the abdominal cavity, which is important for kind of this inside out approach that we're going to talk about, right? Then you look at like the pelvic floor, it has three layers. Um, the coccygeus, the piriformis, obturator, levator ani, and they all operate as like basically a trampoline. And then you look at your diaphragm, which if you look at all the research in diaphragm thickness, which is just really, it's really cool in and of itself, right? So obviously, it's a huge generator of IAP, so intra-abdominal pressure, and it does a great job in like if you have pelvic incontinence or fecal incontinence, and you obviously can't do that because it has that role there. But people don't think about it as a regulator of anything, and so the pelvis and the diaphragm act in like phase lock, and so they kind of move together.
Mm.
Which all these pieces of information are like if you look at them singularly, you're like, oh, these aren't really a thing, but they are a thing because they kind of like all play into each other. Um, so they looked at interesting research in quadriplegic people in a Paralympic game. It's called Boccia, I think.
Hmm.
And they looked at diaphragm descension and how far they could throw the ball. And the more they could
Interesting.
descend their diaphragm, the more they could throw it, which I
Wow.
thought was so cool, right? It's like very cool research. But if you just look at that, you're like, oh, okay, cool. Not thinking like, not only does this have stability within the spine, obviously, I think that's what a lot of people think the diaphragm does. And I think the diaphragm works as like with coinciding with the pelvic floor to create like a hydraulic press of
Hmm.
sorts, right? In the literature, they call it a bellow, which I think is even cooler. I'm like, oh, this like if you like, it's like a wind thing for fires.
Hmm.
So you look at all that stuff, and then you start going into like, okay, so you understand the diaphragm, you understand the top, the bottom, and the canister itself. Obviously, that's going to have some configurations with how they produce force, because your diaphragm and your pelvic floor, if sits into an outlet, which is your pelvis, huge piece of that will be that, if that makes sense. So understanding all that, and then you start to look at, um, there's an interesting paper on like pressure gradients in the body. And so what they did is they sedated them and they put a transducer down their throat so it sat in their stomach, which this was not done in America. It was done in Sweden.
Wow.
Um, and what they learned from this is three parts, and this is all coming to a head. The rate of loading and the component of the pelvic floor is highly dependent upon um, how quickly your organs drop. And so there is a rate of loading part of that. The faster
Hmm.
they drop, right? Because they did jumping and treadmill. The faster they drop, the quicker it would pop up, which
Interesting.
I don't think a lot of people are thinking of pelvic floor as a trampoline for movement. Um, there's a phasic component to it. So pressure seemed to turn on and off on the step rate. And then there is a pressure gradient to it. If you're on the UHP network and you listen to Bill talk, there is always a pressure gradient. So there's a
Hmm.
proximal to distal one, and there's a distal to proximal one going up. Obviously, organs and gravitational pull kind of go like this, and you're always moving. It's an important piece, because when I think of training an athlete, I think of that. I think of this internal like struggle of up and down,
Hmm.
and I think of like how fatigue affects that and decay rates in sprinting, which I think are that's not really what people talk about. Because if you look at sprinting and the way they move, and then the way they move when they're fatigued, and then you see
Yeah.
that top down pressure kind of like squashing them to the floor, and they
Hmm.
become like squatters across the track. It's a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
So I think understanding all of that and then putting it into where is their center of mass? Are they a narrow? So their center of mass is higher. Are they a wide? And their center of mass is lower. If you can understand those three things with an ISA, they have a small ISA, they have a large outlet, makes it much easier to prescribe strength training. Because if you take the example of like a back squat, you're doing a set of five and you're going and you take it like five singles, bop, bop,
Hmm.
bop, 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 is going to be different on the pelvic floor and give you a different output than
Yeah.
a banded oscillatory squat. Right. But I think most people do not think about it like that. I think they just think in terms of not in pressure, but cross bridge
Yeah.
cycling, right? So that's kind of where I start is I try to figure it out, and a lot of the force plate stuff is really helpful because it's basically uh it's just early, middle, and late. And they're going through it, but it's very quick. And you can see when you use their arms how that influences everything because it a lot of the research is on hands on hips.
Mm. Oh,
But
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
you can't use you unfortunately can't because you don't get the true curve of it. because your arms influence the center of
Of
mass.
course, yeah. Pulling it back, your
So
arms behind you. Yeah. I'd love to get to that. Let's maybe just for now, just kind of sticking on that kind of inside out piece, because
mhm.
I think it'll be great to just get definitions and really like lay that down, and then getting into like the force plate, the lifting adaptations, and those types of things. So I did actually want to. I'll have two things real quick to follow up to what you mentioned, and I love like visuals. I love exercises, kind of like massage therapy, like things you can do to feel these things happening.
Yeah.
Someone had programmed this as an exercise. I don't remember who, but it was something like you grab one of those water bags, those long cylinder ones.
Yes.
For baseball, right? You put it in your shoulders and twist with it or whatever. So it's a long tube with water, and go bounce on the trampoline with it. And it's funny because my daughter, she's 8, and she'll bounce on this exercise trampoline in the playroom, like just for like almost hours, it seems like, but like, at least 20 minutes at a time. And so I took the water bag in there and tried it. And it's amazing the force you feel with that extra water as the water hits the bottom, even if it's just 5-10 pounds of water.
Mhm.
It's very substantial. The
Yep.
funny thing is I personally don't think that's a great training exercise, because I got off the trampoline and felt so heavy, like
Yeah.
maybe extended IR, right? Like everything kind of melts into more IR, and I was like, oh, that
Mhm.
I don't think that would work very well. But for a visual to understand pressure, I was like, this is a really good visual. And so even when I do like just a standing vertical jump now on my own, I loop it into like the lifting cycles a lot, and squatting, not yes, for power and to have that marker, but also
Sure.
to kind of feel pressure. And I almost look at it as if you're just jumping and you don't have a target, like you're not playing basketball or volleyball, and you're just, coach says jump, okay, I'll jump as high as I can. You don't have that external thing to dictate a strategy.
Yep.
So for me, I find it interesting to almost try to feel the reversal of the guts and the viscera in my body as the internal cues. And again, this is taking it farther than any athlete would ever need to,
No,
but
for
it's
sure.
more just for my own purposes to just feel and understand what happens if you take on like a pressure-based strategy, or if you dig down real far, like the coach is like, hey, dig down real far in that standing vertical. And you feel yourself get more into your quads, your outer quads, maybe your back's a little, like Bill calls it a superficial strategy.
Mhm.
You bypass the pressure, the optimal pressure piece, and now you got to take on more external big muscles to do it. And you could still jump high. But I find for me, especially neuro ISA too, like I like even the other day, I was doing med ball throws, like a Viking throw. You have the med ball, or granny, different names for it. You have the med ball in
Yeah.
front of you. You bring it down between your legs like a hinging pattern and throw it as high as you can. And I like doing versions of that where it's just like a mid thigh position. Just start from higher, and you just have to blast it. And I
Yep.
could throw it almost as high like that, then bring. Yeah, it's just kind of interesting. But I'm like, the pressure, it's just teaching that instantaneous pressure. And if it was just muscles, I don't think I would think of it the same way. So it's definitely changed the way that I think of those movements. And then I know, let alone all the lifting and things, like you said. Um, but I wanted to ask you, so it's kind of to dig into that on an applied level. You mentioned throwers who could descend their diaphragm further. Would that
Yeah.
mean you can have a greater inhalation, which would mean more external rotation, so you can like wind up better? You know what I'm
Better
saying?
grade. It's just a
Yeah.
better gradient.
Yeah.
What it would come down to, a better gradient to be able to go up with, because they're obviously they don't have function, like they're in a wheelchair.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So it's kind of an interesting piece in that. Like the counter to that is like they did all of these, like all the collegiate sports, and the wrestlers had the largest, thickest diaphragm.
Interesting.
So
Interesting.
but then they did one study where it was like distance runners and bodybuilders. And who would you think would have a thicker diaphragm?
Like probably bodybuilders from all the like exhalation.
Actually, it is just that.
Yeah.
That, and they actually, the higher your VO2 max, the thinner your diaphragm, which
Mm.
I thought was a very interesting thing. But it lends on the, like, I would think that wrestlers are the highest, like all they're doing is pressurizing, and they're
Yeah.
playing like
Yeah.
hand fighting. That's all they're doing is being. Judo was the second one.
Mm.
Sprinters were the third one.
Mm.
So it's an interesting, because people don't think about like pressure. They don't think about um that muscle is made up of water, and that water is hydrostatic like skeleton. And so it's contractile in nature, which is like David Sloba, if you've ever heard that name before.
I don't think so.
He's so he did his he's like 28. He's a Brown PhD student. He did his undergrad in studying worms. Then he went to Brown, and he basically he did more in 5 years for muscle physiology than anyone has done in the past 50.
Hmm.
So interesting to find his like that because of like there's a hydrostatic skeleton to bone that like they actually contract both passively and actively with water. So the water actually acts as a pressurized thing as well,
Interesting.
you know? Yeah, because you kind of hear Bill talk about it on the UHP network and you're like, "What? What?" And then you start to dive into some of the research on it and you're like, "Oh, this is it." Because he did his undergrad on worms, like
Mhm.
tapeworms. And since they're a like they have a hydrostatic skeleton, he kind of did the same thing in there. But he didn't know anything about muscles before.
Yeah.
I thought was so cool.
Yeah, it's so interesting how just like fundamental principles of physics and when you're starting with pressure versus starting with muscles, like you said, like oscillatory, like if it's like, oh, oscillatory reps, well, it's just a stretch shortening cycle enhancer or something, it's like, well, it could be more than that, and it is obviously. It's
Yep.
like, and to think about, you actually, I'll say, you definitely primed me to say bodybuilders with that study because I was thinking wrestlers. Okay, if wrestlers have the strongest diaphragm, I think a lot of people would say, "Oh, they're just conditioning all the time. Oh, they're just the most conditioned or something." That would be the first layer, very binary way of thinking about it.
Mhm.
But it's like, well, what do wrestlers do? Constantly holding isometrics. What does it take to constantly hold these isometrics in different positions? Powerful exhalations and micro
Yep.
exhalations to hold these locks. And I think too, it also it changes the way that you think about training in general in the sense of I like even like roughhousing or grappling and what is
Yeah.
foundational strength, and even I would say below those isometric. Oh, their muscles are good at isometric holds. No, they
Mhm.
exhale all the time in all these different positions. So the core of the body got better at exhaling, and then you would think, hey, that's probably pretty good for like acceleration if you want to be a good accelerator in sprinting or something. Like, and there's a core that probably goes beyond what we think in the more, and yes, the muscles certainly get trained, of course, and
Mhm.
all that, but it's cool to that first primary layer of it all to look at.
Yeah. It's just so interesting that you say that because I think they are kind of like if you look at like a sprinter and like a wrestler, like yes, force output for sure, you need it. But in terms of like thinking of your pelvic floor and your diaphragm as like a hydraulic press in terms of like sprinting, I would think because like if you look at like the delayed training effect of squatting, right? It's if you lift heavy, you see it whatever 4 to 6 weeks later. Well, I think that is the way it is because of how much it takes out like to adjust to that
Yes.
hydraulic press. You've now
Yeah.
turned it slow and it takes that long to be able to pop back up. And then you see the effects of it because it is like that.
Yeah. What's funny is I used to, when I was in high school, I saw that effect big time. Like I would squat
Mhm.
and actually I would say my two leg jumping got better, the internal rotation, but my single leg jumping would temporarily get wrecked. I mean, it would just get destroyed. And then I would stop squatting for a while and then it would just come and rocket back, after like a month or maybe even just 2 or 3 weeks, honestly, of stopping squatting, deep squatting. Not like, so lots of ways to squat, lots of implications with
Yeah.
all that. But so it's interesting to think about, well, what are the things that you gained doing that? And then what are the mechanisms of rebound and overload? And how long can you keep doing that? Because I found once I got to in my mid 20s and I had just gotten so used to lifting and I think my system had fully adapted.
Yep.
I didn't have the issues, the drops like I used to, but I also didn't have some of that just serious just raw elasticity that I had when I was younger. Like, and I want to dig up this video. It was a dunk contest when I was 18. And like Bill talks about muscles being concentric or eccentric. And I think somewhere in college in my early 20s, my feet, my calves shifted from being more concentric to
Yeah.
eccentric to more rear. And I think rear foot for high jump, definitely. But like, I mean, I was like almost tiptoeing up to the hoop in some sense. Obviously I could use my heel, but I mean, it
Right.
was just straight, like just power off the forefoot. Calves were way more concentric. And I would just explode off the ground with this just pop that I had to get it from different places later. I think I probably used more of my foot. Maybe it was healthier later in some respect, but eventually it just got to this point where I became a different athlete just by going through those squat cycles so many times. So I don't want to believe it. I probably told these stories a million times in this
No,
show, so I don't want
no,
to.
that's fine. I mean, I think that is a big piece of it. Like, what's going to make you a better 2-foot jumper versus 1-foot
hmm
jumper, and then the adaptations you get, or the secondary costly things on it.
hmm
Like, if you squat heavy bilaterally, that makes your system in general stiffer, and it
hmm
shifts your center of gravity forward, and then you lose your ERs. That's the first thing to go, generally speaking. And so you kind of lose the ability to get into a good position, which could potentially hinder and make worse. That's kind of like the secondary influences of like lifting weights and understanding where they are. So like for example, like I get a lot of freshmen who have to take weightlifting class in high school, which is great sometimes. But you're getting these better strength coaches at that level that are getting adaptations with them, and they're getting them really strong, but it's moving their space out here.
Hmm.
And so they're squatting like all the way out here. And even if I try to move them in, they're like, "Oh, I feel that all in my back."
Hmm.
And I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah, describe that real quick, because obviously, this hand motions,
yeah,
just for people listening.
sorry.
Yeah, maybe go in
Instead
depth
of
on that
being
space, how they, yeah.
instead of being able to squat shoulder width or a little bit outside of that, their base of support within that is like way further out because that's where their space is. It's been your posterior lever has been concentrically oriented to shove your center of gravity forward, so your pelvis is like sitting in front of your knees.
Hmm.
And so the only space you now have access to is out way wider than it should be. And
Yeah.
obviously there's like some structural constraints with that as well, like how they're structured and all this stuff. That definitely plays into
hmm
it. Sport plays into it, compression plays into it, of course. But when you get really good at lifting weights, your body doesn't want to have a turn. It wants to be stiff because
Yeah.
being stiff is a necessary byproduct to moving heavy weights.
Yeah. Okay, yeah,
So
so let's get into that and what it means for, as well as for the archetypes. So, like superpowers, and I know you said ISA. I know people who have listened to this podcast for a while and are into Bill's work probably are familiar. But if you could just briefly describe infrasternal angle and the two archetypes, and obviously there's a spectrum of, there's the
yeah,
widest
yeah,
wide and
yeah.
the narrowest narrow and all that. But tell me a little bit about those two and their superpowers, and what you're looking at definitively when it comes to training either type for the sake of speed and explosive athletic ability.
Yeah, so wides are normally more force oriented. They have nutated sacrums. They are generally speaking more muscular bound athletes.
Mm,
Within the track world, I have way more narrows. I also have way more narrows within soccer. So that's
mhm,
kind of they're also on the other end of it. They're more velocity. That's their superpower, velocity side of things. Like my narrows love doing plyometrics. They love doing like oscillatory work.
mhm,
They love that side of things and they get very good at it. Um, but because of their pelvis, both pelvises have unique adaptations. They're going to do better with different things. Like I don't do heavy lifting with my narrows because it glues them to the ground.
mhm,
So we do lighten things. Um, we do like banded stuff with them, but in certain dosages because they can only handle so much. So I'm very cognizant to do that based on some jump height numbers on the force plate. But that's kind of the very your infrasternal angle is not an angle, by the way, and
mhm,
Bill always laughs at that. It's a 3-dimensional thing in basically how you are. It's because the tissue is malleable. Those ribs are malleable. They
mhm.
move in accordance to other things that are happening um, down the chain. So
Yeah,
that's why you become a narrow or wide. You can't be wides don't go to narrows, narrows don't go to wides. It's just your movement strategy.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, but yeah, I think just to start out, it is nice to have just that little V, and then appreciate that it's not just that, But I think just for the nice rib cage and the nice starting point for all of us,
But
I do think
but if
it's
you see like narrow, so your infrasternal angle, infrapubic angle, like who set the who is the world record in the high jump right
oh yeah,
now?
Mutaz Barshim, the guy's like the narrowest. Yeah, that's a great example, like because if people
The
haven't seen
perfect
it, yeah,
example of that.
yeah. I think giving examples is amazing because that's like and then versus like a Joe Kovacs, like the widest wide who has the second shot put of all time.
Here, that's the
Yeah,
spectrum. You look
yeah,
at Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt, what superpower is that he's 6'5". He has a high center of mass. He's a narrow funnel.
yeah.
That's his superpower because of his center of mass is so high, his contact length is so long.
Hmm.
That's why he only took 41 steps. No, and that's no disrespect to Usain. Usain's a great competitor, high force output, all the other things, but his structure dictates all of that stuff. For instance, the it's such a great example. One of my short sprints coach here at Clemson, he ran 987 wind aided in college, and he's 30 years old or something around there, and he gets on the force plate now, and I'm like, there's a reason structurally that you did that. He still beats the guys that we have on this current team.
Hmm.
So your structure dictates quite literally everything.
Yeah. What is it? What is he? What's his like
He's
structure?
a narrow funnel. He's
Oh,
like 5'8",
yeah.
but it's yeah,
Like why and
very, very,
funnel?
very funnily.
Yeah, maybe too. Okay, so just to kind of set more, because I know case studies, talking about training interventions too. I know it is valuable to talk about. And Bill had a really good presentation on this in the UHP with the four, like it was. I think it was within his speed presentation, but it was like the funnel, the pylon, the pillar.
Yeah,
I'm probably missing one at the moment off the top of my head, but understanding those. One was like the accountant, one's like
pylon.
the pylon's the accountant. So yeah, within those, and I believe two of those may cater more towards narrow and two may cater more towards wide with the way the hips are shaped or driven. But if you could just explain those two, because before,
Sure.
for people who aren't familiar with these shapes, and I know just the general idea of are you a triangle or are you a pylon is, I think,
Yeah.
a
So
pretty simple place to
his
start
is
too.
the first one all the way to the left is pillar, and you think like Joe Kovacs, you think lineman,
Yeah.
you think wide ISA, wide infrapubic angle, so wide pelvis, basically. Then the next one would be wide narrow, so be a funnel. Uh, then you'd be pylon, so wide on the bottom, narrow on the top, but there's nothing to. It's like the best example of that when you see someone like that is like they just have like, and that isn't being rude, they just have like a dumpy body. You're just like, even if you work really hard, you're not gonna get, or they jump, you're like,
Mhm.
you're not gonna get off the ground ever. That's not ever gonna happen. And then the last one is narrow, and you can be a funnel or a piston through there. But it's just great. They're basically just describing gradients.
Yeah,
Is it obviously goes much deeper than that, and I would suggest everybody who's listening is like,
mhm.
what?
Yeah,
Go go
yeah.
go get Bill's stuff in the UHP network. But that's kind of like understanding their starting structure is going to be like, because it's a canister, because it's an outlet
Hmm.
and a top part, and understanding that it's pressure and gradients is better off than muscles and anything else.
Yeah. If I went back, I taught when I was coaching at a D3 school, D3 NCAA school, Wilmington College. I was also teaching some classes, and one of them was a biomechanics class. And
Mm-hmm.
and I, if I could go back in time, I would have had people jump on a trampoline with different shaped water bags. If you could do that, like with a water bag that's wide up top and
Yeah.
then narrow in the bottom, so you can feel, okay, this is what it's like to have the funnel, the archetype. And that's like the super, I think too, just for learning's sake, like tagging those to like most people who are really elite, high level jumping and sprinting athletes are more that funnel type. I think of Dwight Howard's Superman, right? Like, yeah, there's a reason, like that would be your classical,
Structure got him there.
yeah,
We
structural
we say
archetype.
at Clemson, like, you don't pick your sport picks you. Like in track, you don't pick your event picks you. To a certain degree. Like some of these kids are like, oh, I want to do this. It's like, well, you're structurally never going to be able to do that. To touch on I do want to talk about um the trampoline because you did mention it. I think the trampoline also does a good job it understanding like the yielding and like your rate of loading. And so like working to get off the ground and bounce the gut is really important. So like if you get on the treadmill and you felt like you when you got off of it that you had no bounce, you can do it in a certain way, and you can even tighten the springs on the
Trampoline,
trampoline
yeah.
so that you can do that. Like people have floors that you can be able to trampoline and turn them up so that
Hmm.
you can kind of feel, and basically you're teaching them to produce force where they're able to and rebound the
Hmm.
guts.
Maybe like a
So I think that's an
gymnastics floor.
important, yeah, it's an important piece. Like we use it at Clemson too.
Okay.
They'll just do like 90 seconds on with the water bag, but they have to get off. They'll go like 90, they'll do 90 seconds with the water bag, and then they'll go get on the force plate.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because I think the tightness, like I mentioned, I think a gymnastic floor, right? It's like a real kind of a tighter, but there's still some balance. Or I don't know. Yeah, like a tighter floor. But it'd be interesting to think, just a thought experiment. You have this water bag that's like all like wide at the bottom, and
Uh,
how do I manage this? How do I
it,
figure out how to get higher with something like this structure?
yeah, the water bag essentially acts as your guts. It's
Yeah.
you get to see what's happening. Like I'll have them jump with the water bag. So I ran this whole experiment with like most of my athletes, and I made them hug the bag,
Mm.
like one hand on the bottom, like a baby, and then one hand around it. And they jumped down. They
Hmm.
went down as fast as they could, and they jumped as fast as they could. And the people that obviously could really jump, it made like this like not cylindrical, but like a
Spiral.
circular motion
Yeah.
all the way up, and it looked like a funnel.
A
And
spiral. Yeah.
as they reached the top, the fluid hit the top and it suspended them. So if you ever watch someone
Hmm.
jump and they jump unbelievable, it looks like they just kind of get suspended up there. It's like, oh, that's the fluid hitting the top.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Lila Exogen Wearable Resistance. Exogen is used by coaches such as Randy Huntington and Chris Corfist and is an incredible tool in overloading the angular momentum and speed aspect of human movement. You can get 25% off of Exogen sleeves by heading to lilateam.com and using the code JustFly25. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard like with the funnel, it is you always want to speak to superpowers, right? So I've heard that the pylon, so like the wide bottom, like
Yeah.
someone it might have been Connor Harris or somebody else, but like pointed to like Nikola Jokic in the NBA, who's like
Yeah.
and it's like, oh, you could do spin moves. You have like a lower base of support, so you could do better like spin moves or things on the ground that someone who has a higher center may have more trouble with. So I think it's interesting to, you know.
Yeah.
I think
It
it's
kind of
always good
matches
to
it.
say, well, yeah, you
You
could be
can't
good at
move them.
this. Yeah. Yeah,
You
exactly.
just can't move them, but your output isn't a lot.
Yeah.
But you're grounded you're sitting on the ground pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is always interesting to look at behind pictures of those people,
Hmm.
and it looks like everything is going down or if everything is going up.
Yeah.
I think that's always so interesting because we'll take like static pictures of our kids and to be able to like show long-term changes of stuff, not like muscular stuff, but more changes structurally.
Yeah. So let's get into, so we've talked about infrastructural angle. We've talked about these, four kind of structural archetypes. And I think that's such a great primer because again, to only think of things on the level of muscle and the oscillatories, it's only the muscle cycles. And, we're not thinking about the exhalation. I love that wrestler example, but I just think that's such a powerful piece to say, no, there's things that are internal that are also adapting to all this and the way we funnel and manage pressure. So when it comes to these though, so superpowers, you're saying neuro ISAs, more springy, plyometrics, more oscillatory, less heavy lifting.
I'm gonna do
Why?
1 foot jumpers.
Yeah, generally, yeah, like, exactly. I think I just experienced that to a T as a 1 foot jumper who ruined a lot of my 1 foot jumping ability in my 20s through, and really later 20s, early 30s, like powerlifting programs. I was kind of riding the line all through my 20s and then started doing full powerlifting and just, man, it was crazy how quickly all those reactive strength qualities deteriorated. But so wide superpowers, obviously more the forceful side of things. Could you explain some of those?
they're usually your power lifters. They're usually even your Olympic lifters.
Hmm.
That end of things. You tend to not get a ton of sprinters that are on that end. Like the closest one, and it's hard for me to say, but it kind of looks like it'd be Su, the Chinese.
Yeah.
He looks a little bit wider, and you can kind of tell his center of gravity sits a little bit lower because he gets lower in races,
Right.
and his hip lift is not as much. He's not like his displacement amongst the track is not as good, so his pressure gradient kind of goes down, but he's great in acceleration.
Yeah.
Coleman's that way as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, basically, I'm sure if you just went to a track meet and you looked at who are the guys who are the best at the 60, the 100, the 200, the 400, the proportion of the wide ISAs will be
Starts to go
relatively much
down
higher at the
quickly.
60 and just start to diminish the farther out you go in that distance.
Yeah.
Cool. So looking at that then, I did want to get into, and then just looking through the next question I wanted to talk to you about is how we get into the lifting piece. So, and I
Mhm.
think this is where, sprinting, very universal, regardless of what sport you work with or train or locomotion. And then what obviously goes with that is the lifting. So once we get outside of just like, okay, oscillatories and things, tell me a little bit more about maybe just starting with the narrow and wide archetype. And if you want to go into the four structures, that's awesome.
Sure.
But what are you looking at with, okay, what are some lifts specifically I want to give this person, thinking maybe they can take that lift farther, or how do I change that at some point for them? Tell me a
Uh-huh.
little bit about your thought process with the archetypes and the lifting selection.
So I do kind of just there's like a general like we do still go through like block periodization.
Mhm.
We still kind of do that. And then amongst the program itself, I will give certain people certain ways to do it. Like certain if they're still squatting, I will still give them certain cueing based on their individual structure.
Hmm.
So I don't like look at it like I look at it from the force plate backwards
Hmm.
because I think the force plate does a good job looking at the internal dynamics of the system. If that makes sense.
Hmm.
Because I can go into that a little bit because
Yeah, absolutely.
it's kind of like that is kind of like how I look at it. It's not I'm not looking at it from the perspective of like exercise selection. It's based on like what I'm seeing on the force plate stuff. So if you want, I can kind of go into that a little bit.
Yeah, let's do that. So talk,
Yeah.
and I think too, the thing that comes to mind with this is, obviously not everyone has a force plate, but what Bill has said with the ISAs and all this, he's like, you could still get the answer. It's just it's gonna go a lot faster if you have these archetypes. I'm sure the same thing could be said with the
Yes.
force plate.
Yeah.
You probably could still arrive at this. It's just having the data and having the archetypes can make it a little bit faster of a travel
What
for you.
ends up making it just makes the target of adaptation faster.
Yeah.
So the target is bigger. So, like with narrows, you just generally speaking, you don't want to glue them to the ground. So any sort of an ober, like if you do the pins with them, like any heavy pin squatting, that's not going to work. And the quickest way you can do that is you can just have them jump after.
Hmm.
It's going to deteriorate it very quickly. So that I look at the force, like I can look at the force plate, but anybody can go have them go try to touch something. And if they do something, and so it's like, maybe it's a pin squat, um, and then they go over to the force plate to jump, or they go over to the contact mat, or they just try to hit something. I looked at it and it's like 70, 80%, 85%. It's not going to go like your jumps won't go up at all, but
Hmm.
it should. But if you do that same lift and it's at 40 to 50%, it's going up with
Yeah.
an arrow. So I think understanding that, especially understanding their outlet position, it's going to sit a little bit higher than a wide would. And so being able to differentiate between the two is important as well. So I can have wides and narrows in the same program. I just kind of the narrow, I'm gonna have them go a little higher
Yeah.
and I'm gonna have them go into a dynamic start. The wide, I'm gonna have them do that. The same thing, no dynamic start. I'll just have them go from there.
Yeah. I
So that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. One of the things I've been thinking about more just as a kind of I guess like a mental technique to manage, well, what's the right prescription, and like I like to think about, well, let's draw the bandwidth first. And
Yeah.
I think Bill had said, okay, if you're a wide, and this maybe goes like the jump with the water bag example, how to feel this is a wide produces force. Think about like a banded box squat or something, or a banded deeper squat where have a longer internal rotation window. You have a little room to have a little strain and go. And then maybe the most extreme narrow, it's like, just think like bouncy half squats with one. Watch Homer Mutaz Barshim squats in his training videos. And that's the other end of the spectrum, and then you can give an athlete maybe like a bandwidth based on where they're at.
You know what is hilarious that you're saying that is like I literally just take it back from that variation.
Yeah.
That's exactly how I do it. I just literally take it back. We'll do like single impulse, so it's one trampoline pop, and then we'll go to multiple pops, and then we'll go to an oscillatory with something else. And that's exactly how we do it. But I look at like maximal strength stuff as increase this cross-sectional area, increase the total pressure and fluid of the system, and then everything else is getting it to move, like is getting the pendulum to move up and down in a way that peaks us and gets us moving down the track faster.
Yeah.
That's exactly how I look at it. It's not anything else. Like, and obviously I'm afforded a lot of luxuries at Clemson to be able to look at force plate data and all the other stuff, but if they get off and they don't feel like they have some pop, then you're heading down the wrong direction with the athlete, in my opinion.
Yeah. That's, I think, one of the best things, and I find it funny how people will just like bag on like French contrast and stuff on like social media occasionally. They're like, oh, like this is, and yeah, okay. For like a wide ISA person, especially, and someone who maybe is just really forceful and then goes and does their sport, that's awesome. But I feel like if you don't do complexes, especially with like an indicator or something where you're seeing the result, the fruit of the complex, you miss the opportunity to get a lot of connections. I know that's how I've learned a ton, is through just complexes. And did it help you jump higher at the end? Did it not? And some of the best stuff I found for me as a narrow, one of my favorite movements was actually, and this goes with exactly what you're saying in a sense, is a real like a quarter pin ISO. But it was very heavy. Obviously, if I did a low ISO heavy, that would have messed me up. But just a quarter range to increase that just raw pressurization ability in a range I can handle. I'm not going to compensate. It's my jam. And then I'd go do some faster stuff. I'd go do some speed squats or whatever, and then have a vertical jump looped in there and some other explosive things. That was my jam. That was way better than doing like a traditional deep squat as the lead off of the French contrast. If I did that, I would still get results because of the other things to kind of even it out, but it gives you a chance to say, hey, how can we make this the best for you? If you're jumping an inch higher because we swapped this for this, well, that's probably more of what you need because we're seeing this in real time. So yeah, anyways, I'm sure
you don't even have to know anything about structure or any of the other stuff. That's just, to me, that's just being a coach. Like, oh, your jump height's supposed to be going up. It's not. All right, let's adjust some things. We can go up in weight or down in weight, or the pin's too high or it's too low. But the outcome is to be, and it's also demoralizing for the athletes if like everybody is going up and they're not. They're like, all right, this is supposed to be working, coach. I'm like, oh yeah, it is. So
yeah, that's one of those things too where it's interesting to think about, because I think, some like based on just raw learning strategy, maybe some athletes prefer a little bit more serial versus blocked. And I could see that. Yeah. But at the same time, it's funny. Like and I just talked about this on a recent recording I did, but like when I was first exposed to the ideas of potentiation, it was presented. And again, this is a very one-layered system where we're only thinking of motor outputs and how your nervous system processes motor outputs. And the test would be, okay, we gave athletes squats and we had a vertical jump and these athletes went up and these athletes didn't or something. And it's all about that and the rest intervals. But there's nothing about how the athletes did the squats, and how it fit their structure. And maybe that's why all these athletes didn't go up, but we learn these things as, sports science and our knowledge of the whole thing unfolds.
That's always the biggest thing, is like you looking at, like, I would love to if you could just video some of the athletes so you can tell, who got better, who didn't, or whatever else. I think that's one of the biggest pieces, because it very well could just be like, maybe they're just not doing it right. Because I had the complete opposite effect on my athletes when I ran that, which I think is why research gets a terrible name.
Yeah. I mean, there's also,
shouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like you can only account for so much, and so especially with the limited knowledge of some of the other studies. Not to mention, too, I forgot to mention even just fitness. If you're not, we ran it as a class in graduate school, and half the class, in my opinion, was not in shape for doing max lifts and then going and doing a maximal jump, and they didn't jump higher, and a lot of them just sandbag the lift anyway. So it's like, it's so multivariable. But I'd love to get in the force plate piece, because I think, obviously not a lot of people, not everyone listening has a force plate, but I'm sure we'll make a lot of connections as we go through what these athletes are looking like. So tell me a little bit, Mike, about how the force plate and what you're seeing on the force plate comes into this.
All right. So, jumping, walking, they're all kind of sprinting. They're all forms of propulsion. You have to go through an early, a middle, and late. And obviously they're very condensed on the force plate because you're jumping, but it gives me a insight into their yielding strategy, the internal dynamics, and then obviously the pressure gradient. And then there's the very obvious component of like me watching them as well also helps.
Yeah.
So they have to do it with their arms. They have to, because it obviously fluctuates with the center of mass, and also the rate of change is different because you have the internal organs going down as well. And so, which is why you don't see a lot of bimodal peaks or two peaks with hands on hips. You don't see a lot of it. You
I
see
can see
way
that.
more of it. Yeah, you see way more of it with arms, and you see way more of it with arms is because you basically accelerated all of your organs down, and then you have to work to get back up, and it makes their basically potential energy more going down. So what we'll look at is we'll look at V is 0, so that's peak compression. That's when you're breath holding, you're at the bottom of the squat and you're coming back up. You look at V0 to peak propulsive force and how long it takes you to get there. And then there's some other things based on like that lag time. We're doing a study right now at Clemson of like all the jumps of all the sprinters and all the jumpers to kind of look at that lag time, because obviously displacement is a big time. Like being down there is a big time to be able to understand that. And so I think that pylons, they'll have a peak braking curve, peak braking, and then they'll dip down and then they'll come back up. That dip down is basically all the guts have come down, hit, and now you have to work through it to come back over there and become overcoming. My pistons will be peak braking, peak propulsive will be at the same level. My funnels will be peak braking, will be lower than the higher funnel because they're continuing to accelerate up and their guts have more upward mobility. So I think that's a very cool way to understand it. And also, if you have them go on the force plate between set 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you can understand, are you doing a good job picking the exercise selection? Is your MRSI going down? Is your peak propulsive force going down? To be able to understand, hey, they're doing a good job overcoming this, like all this pressure and fluid going downward to come back up. So I think that's also a bigger piece. And you'll also understand the pylons is like not much you can do. I don't have a lot of them, but I think my biggest reward is trying to get them to jump just a little bit higher, is because it's hard for sure.
Yeah.
But I think that's a huge part of it. Understanding the peak compression, which is V equals 0, peak yielding, the breath hold, and then being it because you basically exhausted all the elastic energy, and now you need contractile elements to become concentric overcoming, and that's that part. So you can kind of separate it. What do they do well with that part, but they don't do well with the other part. So
I was just thinking about a funny thought. I don't know why this came to mind, but I was thinking about how like everyone knows like Mark Ripito is like the cranky, just super cranky about all, anything that's not barbell deadlift and low bar back squat. And he had said, you're never going to improve your vertical jump more than 2 inches from whatever it is. Maybe he was a pylon shape. Maybe he was a serious pylon and then just viewed everybody else as that perspective. I don't know.
You could still move some weight.
Yeah.
It's just you're not going to be that. You're not going to leave the ground well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, that's just the thing though, is I feel like even with an athlete though, to carry that, even if you know that their potential is limited, to still you can't like, be like, oh well, you're a pylon, so you're screwed. You
No,
gotta,
no,
you
I
gotta
I also
yeah,
don't
yeah, yeah.
tell them that
Of course.
either.
I'm
Like,
sure you don't. I'm just thinking, even sometimes I think about even like the Pygmalion effect, which is where if a school teacher was told their class is like brilliant,
yeah.
even if the class isn't, the class still does better. And so I even think about that sometimes, just like, because like the athletes almost can read these little subtleties coming out of you. So that's just, I totally agree with the pylon and the limited, but I'm constantly thinking, okay, what can we do to get this pylon to jump higher? Like, you could do it. Like, what's the secret sauce there?
It's never the people that you help that you're like, "That did really good." It's always the people that you can't help that you're thinking about that are like, "Oh, this one keeps me up at night." This
Yeah,
is the
yeah,
challenge that,
yeah,
like, that's all I think that's all it's I mean, it's never the games you won, it's always the ones you lost that kinda, like, sit with you. It's a kind of the same mantra for me.
yeah. And it's sure too. It's like if you have a structure that just struggles, and I think too a lot of my struggle is actually athletes where I could tell a lot of it was in their the way they approach their like in track their event mentally and emotionally, and I just didn't have that connection, that understanding to get them in the place they needed to be mentally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a little bit more of a not nebulous is the word, but it's a little less concrete than, okay, you're this type. Let's use this exercise. This is going to be
Mhm.
the thing. But even still, I did, yeah, because with the pylon, I mean, it is kind of funny. I'm sure if we're putting our top vertical jumpers on Instagram, oh yeah, this guy, yeah, probably a funnel who just took off, or maybe a wide ISA, more of a funnely type who just took
Yep.
off on your program. And then all the pylons, they'll jump, but they don't get the highlight reel. But how do you? So I'll ask you this: like, okay, if a funnel you mentioned on the force plate, they go down and there's a quicker, I think you said a quicker braking phase or a quicker rebound that you're seeing. Would
Yeah.
that go with like okay, in the weight room you got a bar on your back, it should be a quicker rebound with the bar on your back, and then but a pylon, would you allow them more time to produce force at the bottom? Because obviously you want them to,
No.
you want them to not sit down there.
They
Like, what do
want
you?
to do that. That's
Yeah,
their they
yeah,
want that's what they're good at. We're trying to
okay.
make sure they're not doing that. And so you doing everything like a lot of the times you're doing a lightened method where it's the least amount of
Oh
weight at
yeah,
the bottom, and then they're learning how to pressurize from a bottom up perspective, like they're continuing because their gradient isn't good. Their gradient is going
mm,
down. Everything is going down, down, down. You need to get everything going up, 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 and so they can when that gradient becomes more top to bottom and they're pushing up, it's better for them. So they'll do better with that stuff. The only hard part in my experience with pylons is that the rate of change is not that great,
yeah,
and you're it's going to be marginal at best
yeah,
because you're basically it's like 8 pounds of something in 50 pounds of the bottom, and it's not gonna just pop up
hmm,
because there's nothing down there anymore. It's gonna it's just gonna be slower, the lag. So I always go the opposite within the space they have available to them. So lighten method, and I will even like band it. So when you
mm,
band it, the um the behavior of the tissue, since the rate of loading is higher, is it will like obviously snap too. So we'll do a lot of like banded stuff to basically just strengthen and strengthen the um pelvic floor, basically the trampoline. So those two things, and never like long range of motion things are never going to be good. It's usually half to quarter squats with a dynamic push out of it. Anything to help you overcome that
yeah,
because you're already fighting it. You're fighting gravity, you're fighting your organs, you're fighting your outlet. So
got
you're
it.
fighting your brain.
Hmm. That makes
So
that makes sense to me. So I was just, yeah, I think this is where it gets a little nuanced, because I was thinking like, okay, maybe a wide ISA who's more of a piston or maybe a funnel perhaps. Bill's
mhm,
talked about, well, and you talked about this, like you need to expand space, like you need to be able to expand the space, and like
yeah,
doing like a seated box squat for an athlete, like a wide ISA who needs to expand that area, maybe needs more bandwidth to drop down, but they have no problem reversing it, those types of athletes. So
yeah,
I was just thinking about, okay, like, I mean, I think it's easy. the coverall for vertical jump, I think, and I've heard this in grad school, is like drop down as fast as you can, reverse it as fast as you can. Well, of course, but we can't. It's like there's more to it than that. You have to open the space, and there's a rhythm to it, and all this stuff. So, I just real quick, I did want to say I love the banded and weighting piece because that's something I've been, and especially credit to Bill and being more attuned to that, even just in for mainline training, and probably something you would see more in general population, even as athletes with or individuals, humans with serious pelvic compression, to the point that if you load them in a standard barbell, like they're not going to feel their glutes, they're going to get a bunch of compensations. But when you
Yeah.
say, hey, do the split squat and hold a band, and you unweight, then all of a sudden they can feel more their glutes and their VMOs and their hamstrings and stuff. And what I'm finding is that your weakness, sometimes you really have to unload your weakness more than you would think. Like a lot of people, it's just force, force, force. Let's load. But it's like some people, even less than body weight is needed to work some of those ranges, because otherwise they're just going to be compensations or it's going to be too slow.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the times in my setting, like even taking a step back, like sometimes I have athletes that come in, they have their connective tissues like, too stiff and it
Mhm.
doesn't store at all. And so you're like, you're really powerful. You can do all these things, but we can't get into good positions on the track, or we can't get into good positions when we're jumping. So you're not going to be able to display it, and we're going to be late the whole time. Like you're going to be late on your rhythm, or you're going to be early because your bandwidth isn't good. So it's not only just expression of forces, it's displaying that as well. And I think that's the ER part that Bill talks about, is getting into a good position. If you can't get in a good position because the trade-off is that you've strength trained so much,
Mm.
that's kind of like you're not actually displaying what you have. So it's like we've talked about like being in early helps that. The storage helps that. That's kind of like the triphasic part of things.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that with the triphasic piece, actually, because I know Bill. I think this is just something Bill had said, but like the
Yeah.
early, middle, and late,
Mhm.
we, and again on the lines of the first thing we think about with these exercises is it's just muscular or eccentric. It's just we're teaching, and I think we are. It's motor learning, right? We're experiencing
Sure.
different ways to do it, which is awesome, and I think there's a lot to that. To even to doing lifts, I think the old Soviet research had said the best strength gains was not like a 5:05 tempo, but something like a 2:02, 2 seconds down, because you had enough time to kind of work with the lift. But I
Yeah.
think so much of it, we only think muscles force. We don't think what stance or phase. And yeah, like you had said, Bill had said early, middle, and late. Go in. I'd love for you to go into a little bit of that, because I think a lot of people, as well as the relevance to speed, and then talking about the weight room, so many people are familiar with that system from the V, the and the
Yeah.
neuromuscular side of the V. But let's talk about the stance and the pressure side of that.
Yeah, so all that stuff is based on it's based on gait research from what I gather, and being able to yield initially, and then as your center of grav is moving forward, as your knee is moving and tracking over the midline, you're putting more IR down, more IR down, more IR down, and they're kind of like passing in the night. And then as you go and you reach this moment, which Bill calls max P, then everything that's been stored um, is now released, and you're seeing the benefits of that. This like early, middle, and late attacks these positions because you have connective tissue behavior that is different in all of the
Mm,
positions, and so what you have access to is going to be different, and you can preferentially use that to get subsequent range of motion um, progressions. um, like in an early ER position, you're going to obviously get more of that. So if you do a table test after an exercise, it's going to be different. You might pick up
mhm,
early ER, early IR in that regard. Um, and I think that's really powerful because people don't look at it like that. They look at it like output, output, output. And it's like,
mhm.
well,
Yes.
actually, like if you're in an early stance, you can actually pick up some early ER and actually get into a better position. And then
Yeah.
2 months from now, when you're doing more late stuff, you'll actually see better results because you've yielded the tissue will now yield for you, if that makes sense. That's a very like abbreviated version of Bill stuff. But yeah, I think that's a good analogy with all that stuff.
Yeah. Especially
That's
if,
why it's like that's why triphasic works is because it kind of stays within there, and then once you get to the later stuff, you've now have all the prerequisite components to be able to output well and store well more so, you know?
yeah. And I always found it was so interesting. Like if people watch a standing vertical jump, and the guy who has that high school just jump record, Josh Imitor, I'm sure I'm butchering his last name. It's like Imitor Baby, and he jumped like 47, 48 on the just jump. And you watch his descent, I mean, gets totally folded up. His knees are shooting out to the side at the bottom. It's just like he gets so much external rotation to store potential energy into the drop. And then
Yeah.
the knees will tick in a little bit to you'll reverse it and things like that. But there's so much more than just how much you lift going on. And if you actually spend too much time in the squat rack and deadlifts over time, the amount those knees can go out in the drop, actually, that external rotation starts to drop. And then you have to rely more on just like, like back and pressure and arms or whatever else you got available to make it happen. And so I found this kind of happened on accident, really. Is I remember this was funny enough, mostly with swimmers at Cal, is our base phase for the first month. My logistical solution to having literally, I had 30 athletes. I was the only strength coach who was immediately in charge of that group. And then I had some divers in there sometimes, is I would just have them all line up. You get the bar and a partner, and we would just do slow tempo, like front squats or Frankensteins or whatever. And we'd put plates under the heels a lot. And it would be like 303 or 505, right? I'd just call different tempos. And funny enough, some guys boosted their standing vertical jump more in that phase, where the most we probably went to was like maybe 150 on the bar for a lot of people. But people boosted their standing vertical, at least in that phase, more than other quote unquote power phases of the year. And this was a time too where I was giving some of these narrows more heavy traditional stuff than they needed. I've done case studies on this. It was actually a case study I did for, I think it was Alex Natera, maybe on 2 times, one in the isometric course and one in another thing. But where I had an athlete who was narrow, just straight up total narrow, and wasn't progressing through the traditional lifts. And eventually we just plugged in oscillatory phases for him, a lot of oscillatory work. And finally he blasted through plateaus. But he was a guy who, it was that slow phase that was really good for his standing vertical. And I guess swimmers too, it's their vertical is a little bit different strategy for sure than like a quick track sprinter or jumper. But it was that slower early phase that built out that early, and then it was the just the quick turnover type stuff. And so it was just interesting to see those things with those athletes, because it changes your perspective on, okay, it's just this and that. And that's what like the triphasic, it's cool that you get the exposure to all those types. But I also think too that initial phase that was the slower tempo, people debate that, does that really help you get stronger? It's always, again, the debate's always on strength, and it's not just that. But then that became a lot of super maximal stuff, which probably just shoves you back into late, but and then some. So then it goes late, middle, late again. I don't know. It's interesting to think about those just having that other layer of context to it.
I think that piece is so interesting to think about it. It's like not just what you're trying to attack is always going to have, there are always trade-offs. Like you're always getting a trade-off with something.
Yeah.
And if you drive an adaptation quicker, you get it even faster. Like if you don't want to slow cook the athlete and you want to microwave them, it's going to end up like not usually ending well. Like you're going to, twist bones and much faster than they should be, but you'll get the adaptation. Because that's what I think a lot of people don't understand is like bones will twist under compression and constant volume of it. That's why you see people end up like they look like they're riding a Harley and going out here. And it's like, well, then you twist everything else in the system, and then they're super twisted up, and then you got a hamstring that you're it's not working because they're naturally very twisted anyway. So
I was having that conversation with a therapist who studied under Bill. I think he went to the intensive a while, and his name's James Fryer. He's in town, and I was talking with him and just about that the same thing, like how the pelvis bones will bend over time. And I'm like, your bones bend? And I had that visual in my head. I'm like, I'm working with bent bones from whatever training, and it's interesting to think about the coach who, you get an athlete for a year, maybe 4 years in high school, and you made certain progress, but to think about, well, what were the adaptations that led to that progress? And to just say, oh, don't do early intensification, that doesn't necessarily hit home to a lot of people. It's because like, well, I want to get my, social media reels with these kids and show everyone what I did. But, with the long term, to think about, well, where are they going to go from here? Where are they going to go in the next 4 years? Because adaptation can always be forced, especially when there's a charged environment and you have all these things.
Yeah.
But where are you going to go? And that's why I really do like a 1x20, like half squat, just because you can always go somewhere from there for the most part,
Yeah.
unless you're just killing yourself to get those 20 reps. Just because if it's a half squat, I mean, different, there's going to be different ideal depths, but
Mhm.
and it's 20 reps, so it's a lot of metabolic and that type of thing. I think, I don't know, I constantly come back to that being a pretty good general middle of the road thing for a lot of athletes, and then you can find your little specific nuances later on. But I just think there's a lot there as well. But
I think to your point, like some athletes who aren't naturally athletic and they don't have like on-field talent, like they need to maximize some of these things
yeah,
early on. They just I want to play college sports. Okay. You are not naturally very gifted here, here, and here. We're going to have to make you faster and stronger and all the physical qualities. And there's not going to be a lot left to get there. And as long as they're comfortable with that, I think that's people talk about sports specialization. They always reference these like superstars in the NFL. It's like they played 3 sports because they could, not because the research suggests otherwise. Like,
yeah.
not playing 3 sports doesn't make you better at it makes you better at playing sports, but if you're not great and now we're having really talented athletes, like, I don't know, I always think that research is so funny.
Yeah, I will say there is something to be said. Yeah, to my point about early intensification and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, maybe there is that point where, hey, you got 2 years left in your high school career and you need to get this much faster. Like, okay, I get it. We can, you could say take it out on the credit card, but let's punch it a little bit and see what happens. So, yeah, I shouldn't say that there's not time and need for those situations, but I think if you can just do 1x20 or 1x10
Yeah.
or 12 and play 3 sports, that's the perfect world, because then you can, you can then specialize later, and that's great.
Yeah.
But different needs for sure. So I'd like to close out this with, I know, yeah, hopefully no one's knocking on your door saying, hey,
Oh, no, they haven't yet.
but you had a case study. I think this would be a great place to close out. But you had a case study of a girl who I think had gotten slower through
Yeah.
the not appropriate training, and those are the burned hand always teaches best. I'd love for you to share a little bit of that.
That's a good I've never heard that
It-
saying, actually. That's
yeah.
actually really
Oh, it's happened to me plenty of times. So not literally burning my hand, but figuratively with athletes. So I'd love for you to share that, and then we can finish our time here.
I was actually just looking at her stuff this morning. I was going over it to see like where her projections were coming in. So super narrow funnel, not particularly tall, and in terms of um her like how long her legs are, which I look at too, like how long their legs are relative to their torso. I think is always a good piece to that, because that kind of helps you figure out where their center of gravity is, and also plays into sprinting as well, and potential for that, as long as obviously you understand that. So she came in as a transfer, a 4th year transfer. Um, and she was running like mid 11s, and then she left, she was running 12:02. Obviously didn't have what we wanted to be as well. But I think it's important to understand that it's sprinting is very, very multifactorial as well. So, but I will kind of go into my experience with her. um so the first 5 weeks I had her doing heavy clean pulls from the ground with air quotes, and then back squat clusters, going really more for speed. I think she was between zero point 0.6 and 0.75. That was like her air quote heavy. The second day she did snatch pulls from high blocks, and then front squatted based on a percentage of back squat. And the last day, she basically repeated the first day, but at lower percentages and faster. That was like her basic strength block. Her split squat, I don't even think she could get into the position. So we used dumbbells on a high RX pad.
Hmm.
So that was her first 6 weeks of training. She went from 44 with arms to 56.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, at 56 and 55. So it was like a legitimate improvement. And then we kind of continued on with her. I never really like played around with her training maxes. She was actually the one who was like, I want to do heavier weights.
Hmm.
And I knew in the back of my mind, I was like, I don't think this is going to go well.
Yeah.
But because I knew her, I saw her structure and I was familiar with Bill's stuff. Like obviously not as nuanced as I am now, but I thought, oh, I don't think that's going to go as well. So whatever. Fast forward months later, she was cleaning 165 for 2, and she back squatted like 265 for 5 or whatever. She also had gained at least 20 pounds.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah.
from a compression standpoint, that's a big deal. That's a huge deal as well. So from September to May, she had gained a decent amount of weight. So that plays into it. But even if you look at like her jump height was never as high, but obviously higher peak propulsive power relative body weight, all of the allometrically scaled things we use to like be like, hey, we have transfer of training to the track. Her MRSI was higher. I was like, I don't understand why this young lady isn't putting it together on the track.
Mm-hmm.
Even that, all that being said. And I think it has to do with like her pelvic outlet and how wide versus narrow it was. So wides have a much longer, obviously they're bigger. So they have a much larger space to apply IR down into the ground. Whereas narrows, they have to have some sort of a turn to be able to get into the ground. And in track and field, you don't want a ton of unnecessary left to right movement. You don't want to be on the outside of the lanes because for obvious reasons, because you don't want to take 70 steps in the in the 100 because you're on a time constraint, right? So what I think it was is, and she had mentioned, she's like, I don't feel like I have any pop. I feel like I'm heavy. And I think because that paired with we made her stiffer anterior to posterior, like we compressed her, and her turn, it had to be out wider to be able to put it down. She couldn't grasp that from like a figuring it out perspective because now her bandwidth to produce IR was small before. We made it even smaller because she needed more of a turn and we kind of robbed her of that. So her mindfulness was out to lunch. So she couldn't, a lot of great athletes can kind of put it together in spite of some of the weight room stuff. And she was not doing that. So I think that's one of the biggest things because she was super narrow pelvis, even narrower ISA. And we had gotten her a lot stronger, even in spite of my own trying to do. But that's why I said, like, I think that's what it was. But the jump height thing, that's why I use that. It's not great, but I use it as one of the biggest KPIs because it is a proxy of like how well you can move your pelvic floor up and down and how well you can unweight. I think it's a really, really good indicator of that. But I did try as hard as I could with her. Obviously, I learned a lot, but it's hard because you do think about that stuff and you're like, I think we could have done this, and this. I think if she would have been doing the stuff I'm doing now, where it's more oscillatory based and it's way more like force plate based, like rock or box jumps from an outlet position, single leg, double leg, all that stuff, I think she would have been a little bit better off. But at least we would have not have robbed her of the turn.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, with the 20 pounds, I mean, that's a tough one too, because I think I've had a similar situation where I had a freshman who was a pretty substantial talent, at least for the level I was coaching at, come in, put probably about 80 pounds on her back squat in 3 months, and I was super stoked. I was like, oh, this girl's going to be so good. And also gained probably 5 or 10 pounds, maybe,
Yeah, it
some of it.
matters.
And that's a big deal. And so,
Oh,
yeah, like standing vertical got a little better, but I mean, just was not even, and neuro ISA, and not even,
yeah,
and also just like wanted to be strong, like same thing. And just really, I think it was a little bit of both. It probably
yeah,
was maybe three, if I had to section it out, probably about 2/3 the weight gain, maybe 3/4, and then the rest of it was screwing up the IR windows and stuff like that. And but I for sure I would definitely have trained her differently in the weight room, without
yeah.
question.
That's always a big thing when I ask them how they feel on the track. I think that's a big deal. Like, oh, I feel like I got some good pop, or I'm hitting good positions, or I feel strong in positions. But if they feel like strong in positions all year, like I'm like, we're gonna do something else in the weight room because that's not what you want to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, without question. That's interesting with the turn too. Like I think I had heard that before, but that's something I kind of, amongst trying to remember many concepts and builds in the UHP universe, that's one I think I've let myself forget. But I think it's really interesting and profound, just because I kind of think too a little bit about multi-sport. I know for me, if when I play sports, it is so good for my just general reactivity and
Yeah,
athleticism. And I wonder if the ability to make turns more that come with that is better for me. I mean, it's good for everybody, but like
yeah,
relative to, let's say, a wider wide who's a sprinter or something, maybe it's just more straightforward, literally for them. I don't know. It's just interesting to
yeah.
think about that.
To your point, I think if it's an activity that's like lower in intensity, it's got lower compressive forces, and it's gonna naturally put you in an environment of expansion.
Yeah, I
And so,
think that's a big
like,
one.
even like walking is
Hmm.
like, if you go for a nice walk, you always feel like better after it. Yeah, it's because it's very it's expansion,
Yeah,
because it's not like your heart rate is not very high. There's not a ton of compression within the system. Whereas like sprinting, like you're probably gonna feel tighter after it. It's kind of those activities that kind of keep you moving. That's why they're like motion is the lotion type deal. It's like, yeah, to some extent that is very, very, very true.
yeah. Even like extensive tempo and track, like running
Yeah.
8/200,
Yep.
it's nice and easy,
Yep.
So that's
Big deal.
yeah, it is. I needed that. Like when I didn't play sports, I needed that extensive tempo very badly. Or lots of
Yeah.
things started to deteriorate. I became more of like a standing vertical jump specialist the less I did of that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're always managing like pressures and gravity throughout, because everything is trying to go down and you're trying to manage it to come back up. So you're always playing that interplay.
Yeah. That's awesome stuff. I know, within this world of things, I'm glad we got through the amount we did in this time. However, I know each of these little categories could easily be like what you're seeing on the force plates and case
Yes.
studies could be a lot, but really great stuff. I mean, I not only learned a lot, but also it was great to, like I said, with the little turn thing, remember so many things I've
Mhm.
learned from Bill's model. So, Mike, I appreciate your time so much. This was a great conversation. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for tuning in to another podcast. It was great having you here, and I'll see you next week.